Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Petty-Bourgeois and Proletarian Socialism by Lenin from 1905. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Proletarian number 24, November 7, 1905, the year of the First Russian Revolution. Published according to the text in Proletarian as verified against the manuscript. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 9, pages 438 to 446. Translated by the late Abraham Feinberg and Julius Kotzer. Transcription by the Workers' Web ASCII Pamphlet Project. HTML markup by B. Baggins and D. Walters. And it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. They host thousands of free Marxist texts, including this one. So before we begin the audiobook, I just want to briefly comment. If you're familiar with the Manifesto of the Communist Party, or the Communist Manifesto, you'll know that Marx and Engels talked in that about different types of socialism. Feudal socialism, which is a reactionary kind of socialism which criticizes capitalism, not so much for creating a proletariat, but a revolutionary proletariat, and potentially upsetting the whole apple cart. Marx and Engels also note, quote, "As the parson has ever gone hand in hand with the landlord, so has clerical socialism with feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge." The quote continues with, "Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart-burnings of the aristocrat." They also talk about petty-bourgeois socialism, which they also categorize as reactionary, in that basically it wants to turn back the wheel of history and re-establish outdated modes of production. Quote, "Ultimately, when stubborn historical facts had dispersed all intoxicating effects of self-deception, this petty-bourgeois form of socialism ended in a miserable fit of the blues." And specifically, what classes are we talking about here? Well, Marx and Engels say the feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie and incoming capitalism. The medieval burgesses and the small peasant proprietors were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In those countries which, as of the 1840s when this was written, are but little developed industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeois has been formed, fluctuating between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of competition. In other words, their small businesses are ruined, and they have to take a job as a wage worker. And as modern industry developed, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society, to be replaced in manufactures, agriculture, and commerce by overlookers, bailiffs, and shopmen. So basically, when we talk about the petty bourgeoisie today, we're talking about, well, the name means little capitalists, so small business owners, people living that American dream of starting your own business and then trying to build it into a thriving empire that eventually you can just live off the capital one day and become member of the big bourgeoisie. That would be the dream. The reality is that most of these people's businesses never really get off the ground. They fail. They either start a new one if they have money left over, or they just rejoin the proletariat. Very few of them actually make it across that middle ground into the big bourgeoisie where they can just live off of the capital. And I did say rejoin the proletariat. Not all of them started out as proletarians. Some of them come from backgrounds which are non-proletarian. Whatever the case, for a long time, this was the American dream that the USA held out. Was basically anybody can become rich if you just work hard enough, open a business, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, of course, there are many barriers to actually being able to start the business, let alone most of the businesses that get started fail. So, this was one facet of the large middle class that was sort of the basis of the class peace and a lot of the buy-in that U.S. capitalists got from the rest of the public during the 20th century USA, at least the middle part of it. But, in the 90s and 2000s, people would talk about Walmart, setting up and wiping out Main Street, and then in the 2010s up to now, Amazon wiping out pretty much everything else. Some people call this the retail apocalypse, and, the petty bourgeoisie, a lot of them were small shopkeepers. It was relatively easy to set up some kind of a retail outlet, but as the retail has been consolidated and eventually moved online, and they're just doing it out of warehouses now through the mail, the ground has certainly shrunk underneath the petty bourgeoisie's feet. Some of the older ones were able to retire sort of in time, and a lot of the younger ones have had to join the proletariat, just getting a regular job for wages or salary. So kind of the second category of people who may be referred to as petty bourgeois are people who are involved in management or administration. That is, people who don't own a business, but they do have control over production in a managerial role. They are part of the working class because their livelihood depends on the capitalist keeping them on the payroll. They need that job for wages or salary. However, they are not a mere proletarian due to that control that they have, however slight, over production. They are working class, but their consciousness is going to be different because of that. So the term can refer to different types of individuals with different sort of class trajectories, although their immediate class interests and or immediate class consciousness may be similar or identical. Where they've been, what their class history is, if you will, whether they spent most of their working life in the proletariat, or if they come from more of like a petty bourgeois background and intend to do that forever and expect that may influence their perception of their future class interests, which can also be a factor in their politics. So Marx and Engels go on to describe other types of reactionary socialism: German or, quote, true socialism, conservative or bourgeois socialism, which is not, quote, socialism for the rich, as I saw somebody trying to argue on social media recently. When people say capitalism is socialism for the rich or something like that, yeah, that just means that the rich do well in capitalism. It's kind of a half-assed way of saying that. Bourgeois socialism is not that. It's trying to create a kind of capitalism that basically doesn't have any contradictions or downsides, particularly a revolutionary proletariat. So they go on: critical utopian socialism and communism, and then they finally explain their own position in relationship to the other sort of quasi-socialist parties, etc. So, having refreshed our memory on that a little bit, and if you haven't read that before, please go check it out now. Let's now see what Lenin has to say in 1905 to perhaps expand on these concepts. Of the various socialist doctrines, Marxism is now predominant in Europe, the struggle for the achievement of a socialist order being almost entirely waged as a struggle of the working class under the guidance of the social democratic parties. This complete predominance of proletarian socialism, grounded in the teachings of Marxism, was not achieved all at once, but only after a long struggle against all sorts of outworn doctrines, petty bourgeois socialism, anarchism, and so on. Some 30 years ago, Marxism was not predominant even in Germany, where the prevailing views of the time were in fact transitional, mixed, and eclectic, lying between petty bourgeois and proletarian socialism. The most widespread doctrines among advanced workers in the Romance countries, in France, Spain, and Belgium, were Proudhonism, Blanchism, and anarchism, which obviously expressed the viewpoint of the petty bourgeois, not of the proletarian. What has been the cause of this rapid and complete victory of Marxism during the last decades? The correctness of the Marxist views has been confirmed to an ever greater extent by all the development of contemporary societies, both politically and economically, and by the whole experience of the revolutionary movement and of the struggle of the oppressed classes. The decline of the petty bourgeoisie inevitably led, sooner or later, to the extinction of all kinds of petty bourgeois prejudices, while the growth of capitalism and the intensification of the class struggle within capitalist society were the best agitation for the ideas of proletarian socialism. Russia's backwardness naturally accounts for the firm footing that various obsolete socialist doctrines gained in our country. The entire history of Russian revolutionary thought during the last quarter of a century is the history of the struggle waged by Marxism against petty bourgeois Narodnik socialism. Quick comment: these were the populists, the Narodniki, If you want to hear more about what Lenin thought about them, the original populists, and then the next-gen populists who were called the Socialist Revolutionary Party, check out 2 videos on Socialism for All, What Did Lenin Think of Populism, Parts 1 and Part 2. Short version, he was not a big fan. In fact, said we need to declare war against it. Continuing. While the rapid growth and remarkable successes of the Russian working class movement have already brought victory to Marxism in Russia too, the development of an indubitably revolutionary peasant movement, especially after the famous peasant revolts in the Ukraine in 1902, has on the other hand caused a certain revival of senile narodism. The Narodnik theories of old, embellished with modish European opportunism, revisionism, Bernsteinism, and criticism of Marx, make up all the original ideological stock in trade of the so-called socialist revolutionaries. That is why the peasant question is focal in the Marxists' controversies with both the pure Narodniks and the socialist revolutionaries. To a certain extent, Narodism was an integral and consistent doctrine. It denied the domination of capitalism in Russia. It denied the factory workers' role as the frontline fighters of the entire proletariat. It denied the importance of a political revolution and bourgeois political liberty. It preached an immediate socialist revolution, stemming from the peasant commune with its petty forms of husbandry. All that now survives of this integral theory is mere shreds, but to understand the controversies of the present day intelligently, and to prevent these controversies from degenerating into mere squabbles, one should always remember the general and basic Narodnik roots of the errors of our socialist revolutionaries. Comment, again, this is the Socialist Revolutionary Party. I mean, you could say that Marxists are, generally speaking, socialist revolutionaries. In this case, Lenin is referring specifically to the SR Party, which was distinct from the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Continuing. The Narodniks considered the muzhik, the man of the future, in Russia, this view springing inevitably from their faith in the socialist character of the peasant commune, and from their lack of faith in the future of capitalism. Comment. Basically, these populists considered that capitalism was some kind of a deviation from the agrarian paradise that they were living in, and that they could just sort of throw off capitalism and go back to what they were doing. Continuing. The Marxists, however, considered the worker the man of the future in Russia, and the development of Russian capitalism in both agriculture and industry is providing more and more confirmation of their views. The working class movement in Russia has won recognition for itself, but as for the peasant movement, the gulf separating Narodism and Marxism is to this day revealed in their different interpretations of this movement. To the Narodniks, the peasant movement provides a refutation of Marxism. It is a movement that stands for a direct socialist revolution. It does not recognize bourgeois political liberty. It stems from small-scale, not large-scale production. In a word, to the Narodnik, it is the peasant movement that is the genuine, truly socialist, and immediately socialist movement. The Narodnik faith in the peasant commune and the Narodnik branch of anarchism fully explain why such conclusions are inevitable. To the Marxist, the peasant movement is a democratic, not a socialist movement. In Russia, just as was the case in other countries, it is a necessary concomitant of the democratic revolution, which is bourgeois in its social and economic content. It is not in the least directed against the foundations of the bourgeois order, against commodity production, or against capital. On the contrary, it's directed against the old, serf, pre-capitalist relationships in the rural districts, and against landlordism, which is the mainstay of all the survivals of serf ownership. Consequently, full victory of this peasant movement will not abolish capitalism. On the contrary, it will create a broader foundation for its development, and will hasten and intensify purely capitalist development. Full victory of the peasant uprising can only create a stronghold for a democratic bourgeois republic, within which a proletarian struggle against the bourgeoisie will for the first time develop in its purest form. These, then, are the two contrasting views which must be clearly understood by anyone who wishes to examine the gulf in principles that lies between the socialist revolutionaries and the social democrats. According to one view, the peasant movement is socialist, while according to the other, it is a democratic bourgeois movement. Hence one can see what ignorance our socialist revolutionaries reveal when they repeat for the 100th time, see, for example, Revolutionная Россия, number 75, that orthodox Marxists have ignored the peasant question. There is only one way of combating such crass ignorance, and that is by repeating the ABC, by setting forth the old consistently Narodnik views, and by pointing out for the 100th or the 1000th time that the real distinction between us does not lie in a desire or the non-desire to reckon with the peasant question, in recognition or non-recognition of it, but in our different appraisals of the present-day peasant movement and of the present-day peasant question in Russia. He who says that the Marxists ignore the peasant question in Russia is in the first place an absolute ignoramus, since all the principal writings of Russian Marxists, beginning with Plekhanov's Our Differences, which appeared over 20 years ago, have in the main been devoted to explaining the erroneousness of the Narodnik views on the Russian peasant question. Secondly, he who says that the Marxists ignore the peasant question thereby proves his desire to avoid giving a complete appraisal of the actual difference in principles, giving the answer to the question whether or not the present-day peasant movement is democratic bourgeois, whether or not it is objectively directed against the survivals of serfdom. The socialist revolutionaries have never given, nor will they ever be able to give, a clear and precise answer to this question, for they are floundering hopelessly between the old Narodnik view and the present-day Marxist view on the peasant question in Russia. The Marxists say that the socialist revolutionaries represent the standpoint of the petty bourgeoisie, in other words, are ideologists of the petty bourgeoisie, for the very reason that they cannot rid themselves of petty bourgeois illusions and of the Narodnik imaginings in appraising the peasant movement. That is why we have to go over the ABC once again. What is the present-day peasant movement in Russia striving for? For land and liberty. What significance will the complete victory of this movement have? After winning liberty, it will abolish the rule of the landlords and bureaucrats in the administration of the state. After securing the land, it will give the landlords' estates to the peasants. Will the fullest liberty and expropriation of the landlords do away with commodity production? No, it will not. Will the fullest liberty and expropriation of the landlords abolish individual farming by peasant households on communal or, quote, socialized land? No, it will not. Will the fullest liberty and expropriation of the landlords bridge the deep gulf that separates the rich peasant, with his numerous horses and cows, from the farmhand, the day laborer, i.e. the gulf that separates the peasant bourgeoisie from the rural proletariat? No, it will not. On the contrary, the more completely the highest social estate, the landlords, is routed and annihilated, the more profound will the class distinction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat be. What will be the objective significance of the complete victory of the peasant uprising? This victory will do away with all survivals of serfdom, but it will by no means destroy the bourgeois economic system, or destroy capitalism, or the division of society into classes, into rich and poor, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Why is the present-day peasant movement a democratic bourgeois movement? Because, after destroying the power of the bureaucracy and the landlords, it will set up a democratic system of society, without, however, altering the bourgeois foundation of that democratic society, without abolishing the rule of capital. How should the class-conscious worker, the socialist, regard the present-day peasant movement? He must support this movement, help the peasants in the most energetic fashion, help them throw off completely both the rule of the bureaucracy and that of the landlords. At the same time, however, he should explain to the peasants that it is not enough to overthrow the rule of the bureaucracy and the landlords. When they overthrow that rule, they must at the same time prepare for the abolition of the rule of capital, the rule of the bourgeoisie, and for that purpose a doctrine that is fully socialist, i.e. Marxist, should be immediately disseminated. The rural proletarians should be united, welded together, and organized for the struggle against the peasant bourgeoisie and the entire Russian bourgeoisie. Can a class-conscious worker forget the democratic struggle for the sake of the socialist struggle, or forget the latter for the sake of the former? No, a class-conscious worker calls himself a social democrat, comment in those days that just meant Marxist, for the reason that he understands the relation between the two struggles. He knows that there is no other road to socialism save the road through democracy, through political liberty. He therefore strives to achieve democratism completely and consistently in order to attain the ultimate goal, socialism. Why are the conditions for the democratic struggle not the same as those for the socialist struggle? Because the workers will certainly have different allies in each of those two struggles. The democratic struggle is waged by the workers together with a section of the bourgeoisie, especially the petty bourgeoisie. On the other hand, the The socialist struggle is waged by the workers against the whole of the bourgeoisie. The struggle against the bureaucrat and the landlord can and must be waged together with all the peasants, even the well-to-do and the middle peasants. On the other hand, it is only together with the rural proletariat that the struggle against the bourgeoisie, and therefore against the well-to-do peasants too, can be properly waged. If we keep in mind all these elementary Marxist truths, which the socialist revolutionaries always prefer to avoid going into, we shall have no difficulty in appraising the latter's, quote, latest objections to Marxism, such as the following. Quote, why was it necessary? Revolutionaria Rossia number 75 exclaims, quote, first to support the peasant in general against the landlord, and then, i.e. at the same time, to support the proletariat against the peasant in general, instead of at once supporting the proletariat against the landlord, and what Marxism has to do with this, heaven alone knows, unquote. This is the standpoint of the most primitive, childishly naive anarchism. For many centuries, and even for thousands of years, humanity has dreamt of doing away, quote, at once, with all and every kind of exploitation. These dreams remained mere dreams until millions of the exploited all over the world began to unite for a consistent, staunch, and comprehensive struggle to change capitalist society in the direction the evolution of that society is naturally taking. Socialist dreams turned into the socialist struggle of the millions, only when Marx's scientific socialism had linked up the urge for change with the struggle of a definite class. Outside the class struggle, socialism is either a hollow phrase or a naive dream. In Russia, however, two different struggles of two different social forces are taking place before our very eyes. The proletariat is fighting against the bourgeoisie wherever capitalist relations of production exist, and they exist, be it known to our socialist revolutionaries, even in the peasant commune, i.e. on the land which from their standpoint is 100% quote socialized. As a stratum of small landowners, of petty-bourgeois, the peasantry is fighting against all survivals of serfdom, against the bureaucrats and the landlords. Only those who are completely ignorant of political economy and of the history of revolutions throughout the world can fail to see that these are two distinct and different social wars. To shut one's eyes to the diversity of these wars by demanding, quote, at once, is like hiding one's head under one's wing and refusing to make any analysis of reality. The socialist revolutionaries, who have lost the integrity of the old Narodnik views, have even forgotten many of the teachings of the Narodniks themselves. As the selfsame Revolutionaria Rossia writes in the same article, quote, by helping the peasantry to expropriate the landlords, Mr. Lenin is unconsciously assisting in building up petty bourgeois economy on the ruins of the more or less developed forms of capitalist agriculture. Is this not a step backward from the standpoint of orthodox Marxism, unquote? For shame, gentlemen, why, you've forgotten your own Mr. V.V. Consult his Destiny of Capitalism, the sketches by Mr. Nikolai Ahn, and other sources of your wisdom. Footnote there, V.V. was a pseudonym of V. Vorontsov, author of the book The Destiny of Capitalism in Russia. Nikolai Ahn was a pseudonym of N. Danielson, author of the book Sketches on Our Post-Reform Social Economy. Both men were ideologists of liberal narratism of the 1880s and 1890s. Back to the text. You will then recollect that landlord farming in Russia combines within itself features both of capitalism and of serf ownership. You will then find out that there is a system of economy based on labor rent, which is a direct survival of the corvée system. If, moreover, you take the trouble to consult such an orthodox Marxist book as the third volume of Marx's Capital, you will find that nowhere could the corvée system develop, and nowhere did it develop, and turn into capitalist farming except through the medium of petty bourgeois peasant farming. In your efforts to scatter Marxism to the winds, you resort to methods too primitive, methods too long ago exposed. You ascribe to Marxism a grotesquely oversimplified conception of large-scale capitalist farming, directly succeeding to large-scale farming based on the corvée system. You argue that since the yield on the landlord's estates is higher than on the peasant farms, the expropriation of the landlords is a step backward. This argument is worthy of a fourth-form schoolboy. Just consider, gentlemen, was it not a step backward to separate the low-yielding peasant lands from the high-yielding landlords' estates when serfdom was abolished? Present-day landlord economy in Russia combines features of both capitalism and serf ownership. Objectively, the peasant's struggle against the landlords today is a struggle against survivals of serfdom. However, to attempt to enumerate all individual cases, to weigh each individual case, and to determine with the precision of an apothecary's scales exactly where serf ownership ends and pure capitalism begins, is to ascribe one's own pedantry to the Marxists. We cannot calculate what portion of the price of provisions bought from a petty shopkeeper represents labor value, and what part of it represents swindling, etc. Does that mean, gentlemen, that we must discard the theory of labor value? Contemporary landlord economy combines features of both capitalism and serfdom, but only pedants can conclude from this that it is our duty to weigh, count, and copy out every minute feature in every particular instance, and pigeonhole it in this or that social category. Only utopians can hence conclude that there is no need for us to draw a distinction between the two different social wars. Indeed, the only actual conclusion that does follow is that both in our program and in our tactics, we must combine the purely proletarian struggle against capitalism with the general democratic and general peasant struggle against serfdom. The more marked the capitalist features in present-day landlord semi-feudal economy, the more imperative it is to get right down to organizing the rural proletariat separately, for this will help the purely capitalist or purely proletarian antagonisms to assert themselves the sooner, whenever confiscation takes place. The more marked the capitalist features in landlord economy, the sooner will democratic confiscation give an impetus to the real struggle for socialism, and consequently, the more dangerous is false idealization of the democratic revolution through use of the catchword of socialization. Such is the conclusion to be drawn from the fact that landlord economy is a mixture of capitalism and serf ownership relations. Thus, we must combine the purely proletarian struggle with the general peasant struggle, but not confuse the two. We must support the general democratic and general peasant struggle, but not become submerged in this non-class struggle. We must never idealize it with false catchwords such as socialization, or ever forget the necessity of organizing both the urban and the rural proletariat in an entirely independent class party of social democracy. While giving the utmost support to the most determined democratism, that party will not allow itself to be diverted from the revolutionary path by reactionary dreams and experiments in equalization under the system of commodity production. The peasant struggle against the landlords is now a revolutionary struggle. The confiscation of the landlords' estates at the present stage of economic and political evolution is revolutionary in every respect, and we back this revolutionary democratic measure. However, to call this measure socialization, and to deceive oneself and the people concerning the possibility of equality in land tenure under the system of commodity production, is a reactionary petty-bourgeois utopia, which we leave to the socialist revolutionaries. And that is the end of the audiobook. So, I don't really have further comments. I think Lenin kind of beat this one to death. So, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they've allowed me to produce a lot more content for the channel than I would have been able to do without that support. Thanks again. Also, after the content has been produced and uploaded, engagement counts. So like, share, subscribe, comment, all that stuff, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of it helps YouTube to recommend this content to new people, gets it in front of more eyeballs, and keeps expanding the audience. Capitalism is in serious crisis. We need to improve the quality of the left, get more people engaged in understanding this kind of history and theory, so that the struggle against capitalism can take on better and more productive forms with fewer mistakes. Along those lines, join an organization if there's a good one at all in your area, whether you're in a city or a rural area. The organizations tend to be more pronounced in the urban areas just because more people live there. So there are greater odds of getting people together. But if you're in an area where there aren't orgs or aren't good orgs, try to find a good org and at least join at the national level, and then, see if you can participate in some way until there are more people in your area, or until you live in a different area where there are more people to join up with. All right, thanks again, and we'll catch you in the next video.